Hello and welcome to everyone who has logged on from home today. We are very excited to be hosting Tanya Heaslip. Might just wait a second and start again because the attendees are just coming on now. Welcome everyone that's joining us at the moment.
Hello.
Okay, thank you everyone for joining us today. My name's Angela. We've got Tanya with us today and we've got Eve. Thanks for logging on from home, and I just wanted to say this is our very first online author talk that we are doing, and it's quite exciting for us. So we're from Onkaparinga Libraries, and I wanted to also thank Allen and Unwin Publishers for giving us the opportunity to host Tanya Heaslip today. I'd also like to thank Dimmicks from Glenelg for stocking Tanya's book. And I wanted to let you know that if you wanted to put the book on hold through the libraries, you can do that through our catalogue. You can also purchase a copy from Dimmicks at Glenelg on the phone or in person. If during the whole event, we won't be able to see you, the participants, but you'll be able to see us. If you have any questions that you'd like to ask, please do it through the question and answers tab at the bottom of your screen. And at the end of our discussion, if we have time, Eve will ask the questions. So without any further ado, I'd like to welcome Tanya to our talk today. And Tanya's going to read a little bit from her book.
Thank you, Angela. Thank you very much. Thank you to Eve, and thank you to all the Onkaparinga watchers, viewers, readers out there. It's so exciting to be here. So, Angela, shall I kick off with a short reading now?
That'd be excellent. Thank you.
All right. Well, as you can see behind both Angela and Eve, I've got a wonderful display of the cover of my book, which is very exciting for me. And you'll see there's an Alice girl on that cover with a long plait down the back and the hat, and that was us, and that's what we wore and looked like back in the 60s and early 70s. So I'm going to read to you from the prologue, which is called The Cattle Duffers, and that girl you can see in all those photos was me in this scene. Coo! The call ripped through the hot, still air. I swiveled in the saddle, hands tight on the reins, straining to catch the direction of the sound. My skewbald mare Sandy moved restlessly under me, her ears pricked, sensing my anxiety. To the west lay a rocky rise, shrouded in blue-grey mulga, but if the sound had come from behind that rise, it was impossible to tell. Behind me, a dry creek bed dropped away to the south, lined by river gums wilting in the afternoon heat. There was no sign of anyone there, nor did it seem like a likely hideout. I cupped my hands around my mouth and shouted back in return, "Coo!" The words hit the low hills and reverberated back, while above a hawk rose high into the vastness of the currents of a willy-willy. Like my shout, the hawk was soon a speck in the emptiness, swallowed by the big blue bowl of sky overhead. Sweat rained down the back of my thin cotton shirt. The sun burnt my arms. Time was running out. So that's the first page of my book, An Alice Girl.
That's fantastic. I have to say, Tanya, I don't often read non-fiction titles, but when I knew that you were coming here today, I thought I'll read it, and I loved it, and it really gave me a really good, it made me think about outback life, especially outback life before phones, because there's a couple of scenes in there where a phone would have been really handy. The other thing I thought was amazing, that even from a very young age, you seem to know that you were going to write stories, and I thought that was quite inspiring as well. Would you like to share with the audience what inspires you to write this book?
Well, I think it's a whole series of events, Angela. It began with me writing stories as a child about this land and this life that I knew, and I really knew no other life but the outback and the isolation, where our pets were our friends, our horses and dogs and little calves, potty calves were our friends, and I had my siblings, a younger sister and two younger brothers, and that was it. So that world was all encompassing, and I was a very curious, bookish child, and I loved to read. And so before long, the stories were just pouring out of me. First of all, I wrote, and then I tapped away with one finger on a little typewriter. And I just I just knew when I grew up, I was going to be a writer. But of course, life intervened, as life does, and I went on and ended up practicing law. And I don't know if there are any lawyers out there watching, but for me, law absolutely took away my creativity, and that I'm not sure which side of the brain is which, but one's analytical, one's creative, and law just developed that analytical side, and I almost lost my creativity. But that desire to write never went away, and I went to Prague through a whole wonderful series of coincidences in 1994, just after the Berlin Wall fell, and the experiences I had there just drove me to write that story. And that's the story you can see there on my bookshelf, and which is called Alistair Prague. And I talked about the exoticness of Eastern Europe and how exciting it was for me. And a colleague said, you know, Tanya, you think Eastern Europe is exotic, but for most Australians, Central Australia is as exotic as Central Europe. And I was quite dumbfounded by that, because even though all through my life people said, oh, your childhood was unusual, it still felt completely normal. It still does. And I think for all kids, however they grow up, that's their norm. But bit by bit, I realised there were stories to tell, and it was a time that now is quite, you know, that time and the way we lived is not the same today. The outback land remains unchanged, but things have improved, of course, and people live differently to how we did in the 60s and 70s. And so after Alistair Prague, I thought, now's the time. And so an Alice girl was born.
That's excellent. In your first chapter, you very early on in the book, you talk about the game that you used to play, Cattle Duffers, and I felt very nostalgic when I read that, because I used to play similar games with my kids when they were small. And you were talking about like going off into the big wide world, and my kids are that age too where they're doing that, so it was quite interesting parallel. But I wondered if you could tell us about how it was growing up in the country, because it's sort of very isolated to how most of us grow up.
Well, I think, as I mentioned before, it wasn't isolated to us because it was completely normal. So this world was our world. It was all we knew. But if I reflect on it, it was incredibly isolated, because not only were we in Central Australia, which even today is isolated from the rest of Australia, you know, it's 1,000 miles pretty much every which way. It's Central Australia. And we lived on a cattle station that was quite small compared to other stations, but it was still 700 square miles. And that's a lot of empty land space, you know, huge blue skies where you can't see anyone or anything for miles. So that which was isolation, and that which we didn't know was isolation, actually was wonderful for my imagination, because I had nothing whatsoever to interfere with an imagination, you know, growing wild. And I read wonderful books from the School of the Air Library, which were mostly Enid Blyton and set in England. So in my overactive imagination, I had parts of England and parts of the bush all interconnected, and English children having bush adventures, bush children having English adventures, and they all intermixed. And so that isolation fueled this hodgepodge of stories and ideas.
How was it growing up with your family? Because in the book, your family, whilst incredibly loving, were also incredibly tough. So how was it growing up with really tough parents? And I could really get a sense in the book about how close you were with your siblings. Are you still close to them?
Well, to answer your first question first, again, we didn't know they were tough, but Dad was terrifying. He brought no nonsense, and in the bush, survival is a hugely important, well, it's your number one requirement that's drilled into you from a very young age. Access to water, not getting, sunstroke, managing the seasons, managing the heat, managing the cold was priority, because people can die in Central Australia in a day. It's very easily done if it's boiling hot, freezing cold, no water, no cover. So our father was unbelievably tough, but that was one of the reasons I think survival drove him, and we were just terrified, absolutely terrified of him. So he was our hero, and he could do everything better than anybody else. So not only were we terrified, but we longed to emulate him. And I think in that developed this camaraderie with my siblings, because we didn't have any other children to play with. We didn't have any other children around. We only had each other. And we worked from a very young age, because stockmen came and went. But in the bush, your kids are your stable workforce, and it's the same everywhere. So that we kids were taught to ride and had to start working in the stock camp as soon as we could, and that was very, very normal. And again, that developed our bond, because we did everything together. We went to school together, we rode horses together, we mustered cattle together, we played music together, and so yes, we are still incredibly close today, which is wonderful.
In your book, I really got the sense that you felt a bit different from your siblings, in the sense that you enjoyed riding, but they really, really enjoyed riding, and you really enjoyed other, like, study. Can you tell us what the School of the Air meant to you?
The School of the Air was my connection to the outside world. And for me, it was absolute theatre. It was just so much fun. We'd have correspondence school lessons, which were written lessons, which we did in sets, packs of 14 days worth of school. And that would be sent away to the correspondence school in Adelaide to be marked. And so we'd go from 7:30 to 1 o'clock each day, working just on these written lessons, my siblings and I in a little classroom. But for half an hour of that day, we could leave and go across to the little radio and pick up the microphone and tune in for half an hour of theatre with the Alice Springs School of the Air, where we could hear a teacher live and other students our own age from other stations around. And we didn't know what their faces looked like, but we could, through our imagination again, we could put faces on the voices. And so that was a connection to the outside world that I just loved. And I was so lucky, because I had this incredible teacher called Mrs. Hodder, and she encouraged the fact that I loved to engage on School of the Air and that I loved study. So I think from that very early age, I loved a microphone.
That's excellent. You obviously, it was very normal for you where you were living and what you were doing, but for us it's not, and so reading your book, it's definitely different. And you've got 2 books now written about you growing up and leaving home. I sort of think, is there more books to come? Have you got more stories to tell, or what do you think you'll do next after this?
I think I've got a lot more stories to tell, because the bush is full of stories and characters from that time. So I'm really hoping that there's a real interest for these kind of stories in An Alice Girl particularly, and if so, whether I'll be able to persuade my publisher to let me keep writing some more, because there's definitely an interest out there, and also it's about a time that no longer exists. So I certainly hope so, Angela.
Thank you. Eve, I'll switch over to you. Have you got any questions from the audience?
Yes, we've had one just come through that minute. So I didn't realise the School of the Air had a library service. How often did you receive new books, and were you able to choose them yourself?
So yes, one of the most exciting things about School of the Air was that it had a library. It was a little brick room on the side of the School of the Air. It was quite dark, and it was just wall-to-wall books.
Any library's a good library.
And so I fell in love with libraries right from that moment. Libraries are still some of my favourite places to be. So no, I didn't really have a say, because what would happen was Mum would drive into town once a month or thereabouts to get stores, to get supplies. As a rule, we kids didn't go with her because we were at school or we were out mustering. And she would go to School of the Air, excuse me, and she would talk to Mrs. Hodder, and they would select a big box of books that Mum would bring home for us. Now, what was interesting, I look back now and think, where did that library come from? I mean, this was Alice Springs, in the middle of nowhere, back in the 50s and 60s. You know, that library was put together. I'm not sure, but I think books might have been donated or sent up from elsewhere, and there was a huge number of Enid Blyton books there. So I was exposed to and fell in love immediately with everything that Enid Blyton wrote, because she wrote about children having adventures without parents, where the goodies always beat the baddies. There was always a happy ending, and usually it was the kids that pulled it off. And so what was not to love about these books? And they were early thrillers. I love thrillers as an adult, and I'm sure that came from reading, you know, Enid Blyton all those years ago. And starting with The Magic Faraway Tree, and then The Secret Seven and The Famous Five, and so it, you know, went on. Just everything I could read that she wrote, I did. And so Mrs. Hodder, the teacher, and Mum kept up a steady supply to me. They did also have some other books in the library that were more current, like Colin Tearley. So we did get to read a number of his books, which were wonderful. They were the only Australian books, though, you know, Australian fiction that we were exposed to, leaving aside all the bush stories that we grew up with, and you know, it was folklore and in music around us and bush songs and stories. But that was perhaps the only real Australian fiction that we read at the time. And February Dragon, of course, was a huge winner for us, because we lived with bushfires and we understood how catastrophic that was. And then there were the Silver Brumby books that started to come in, and we adored them. Evelyn Mitchell, I don't know how many she wrote, but you know, we just loved horses. So then as time went on also, and I think the School of the Air might have started catering maybe a little for not just my taste, but my sister and brother, because we all love the same sort of books. And my sister and I really then wanted to start learning about Pony Club, and there were a whole lot of English Pony Club books that we devoured. So it was a most eclectic style of reading, that over which I really had no say, but almost everything I loved, and it either involved children having adventures or life on the land or animals, you know, and horses were the biggest part of our lives. So that's a long answer to your question, but hopefully that gives you a picture of what it was like back then. And yes, as a result, ever since, I love libraries.
That's what we like to hear. I've got another question come through. Tanya, you talk so lovingly about your life growing up in the Northern Territory. Do your siblings feel the same as you do about your childhood? Are they still closely connected and involved in NT life?
Yes, and yes is the short answer to all of that. I was the one who went away the most, in fact, as I grew up and went off. My sister and my two brothers have lived in and around Alice Springs and on the land and on our property, off and on ever since we were children. My sister is now a teacher, but she lives in Alice Springs, so this was where she made her home. She wanted to be as close to Central Australia as possible, and the boys, the two boys, one's on the land here, one's on the land in South Australia, but they come and go because that that connection to the land here is so strong. You know, it's in our DNA almost, and it's the place where we feel the most connected and grounded. And if we're away for any length of time, which I was for much of my working life, I would travel back as often as I could, sometimes 2 or 3 times a year from wherever I was living. And Brett, Ben and Melissa have really spent most of their adult lives here in one way or another.
Lovely. Now I've got a question from Pam. Do you tell your stories to primary school children? If so, do you have any special techniques? My grandchildren often ask me to tell them about when I was their age.
I haven't told these stories to school children, but it's a really good idea. It's a really good idea. No, I haven't. I should ask my sister if she thinks there's some school children who would like to hear about it. But I do know that Mum, who is still with us and still lives out on the station, her grandchildren say to her all the time, Nana, tell us about the olden days, which is when we were growing up. So she recounts lots of those stories that have actually ended up in my book. And I'm hoping the eldest, Joe, who's 9 now, will soon become interested enough to read parts of this book because he's fascinated about the olden days. I never thought I'd be part of the olden days. It's very sobering and humbling to realise that you now fall into that I now fall into that category.
You might have to write a picture book next.
Yeah, maybe. Maybe. I don't know if you can see, but way over in the distance, just under the post of an Alice girl, is a light green covered book.
Yeah.
And that's called Adventures at Cutter's Creek. And the picture on the front I drew, that's me on a horse chasing a bullock with hill behind it. So you can't really see it. But that was one of the books I wrote as a child, and I write about in an Alice girl. And I drew pictures all the time. So and I've illustrated that as well, so maybe I should consider that, although I don't think drawing really is my skill set, to be honest. No, when I went to secondary school, I was asked to lead art class because I'd never studied art, and I couldn't get the paint inside the lines, and I was a disaster. So I'm a bit traumatised about art now as an adult.
Oh dear. Okay, the next question is from Meredy. Hi Tanya, I'm really enjoying your book. I'm amazed by the strength of character and resilience shown by your parents moving to Bond Springs as young parents with 3 small children. Could you comment on how you think they were able to do that?
Thank you, Meredy. That is a very good question because I often ask myself that same question. How did they do it? I think there are a number of factors. They were both highly motivated, passionate, independent people who became pioneers without realising they were pioneers. They both had big dreams, and those dreams connected. And I think they were just one of those very driven, energetic couples who together, what's that expression when the sum is greater than the whole of the parts? And I think that was the case for them. How they did it with 3 young children, to me, is a complete mystery, especially going out to Bond Springs where there was nothing. It was drought ridden. This big, beautiful old homestead, but it was filled with red dust. We had to sleep outside on the lawns in swags, you know, often because it was too hot inside. And I remember Mum saying after big dust storms, even if we slept inside, we'd get up and you could see the shape of our bodies where we'd slept on the sheet by the red dust around us. So it was incredibly tough. There was hardly any electricity, a tiny bit in the morning and at night, 32 volt, which if anybody listening knows about 32 volt, it's, you know, very, very weak. Basically run off a battery. And limited water, limited fruit and vegetables, almost none. We lived on beef, and that loneliness of being isolated. So I think it was their determination and drive to leave country South Australia and create something new. And also, we say in the law, there's nothing like a deadline to focus the mind. And for them, there was nothing like a very big overdraft to focus the mind, because to buy the property, they had to take out an enormous overdraft, and running the property was subject to complying with government conditions every year, and initially 3 years. If they hadn't been successful in those first 3 years in meeting those conditions, the government would have taken the station away from them without any compensation. So they had a lot riding on being successful. So I think sheer desperation and that overdraft combined with their just inner energy and optimism is probably the answer.
Well, following on, a little bit of a different track from that, in your life, you've had so many different people come to the station and into your life. Did you find this difficult?
That's a very interesting. Is that your question, Eve?
No, that was one that was sent in.
That's a very good question, because I think in later years it became harder because there were so many people there all the time. As children, we loved it because it was a distraction and it provided some diversification from a very small family unit. We had stockmen that came and went, and stockmen who came and went in the 60s and 70s were mostly that archetypal, taciturn, stoic, silent man of the land who is happier with a horse and a dog than speaking to other humans. And many of them were like that. And, we found that quite fascinating. We trailed around after them and drove them crazy, asking questions. And then there were characters. Ray Murter was a young Irish stockman who came to us and played guitar. And he introduced us to playing guitar, and we loved him and we constantly hung around him. Please teach us how to play guitar, Ray. We had a governess, and a governess initially that we loved so much, Leslie Clark, who still lives in the Flinders Ranges. That's where she came from, and she's now back there. And so she was a bit like she was a bit spit spot, she had just that little bit of Julie Andrews about her. And so there was no one on the station who was boring. Everybody was different and unusual. And so that was fascinating. And I'm sure that also triggered my imagination a lot, because there was no one there who was just, if there can be such thing as an up and down ordinary person, probably not. But the bush attracted larger than life characters because you had really to be larger than life to live there. So in those early days, especially as kids, it was just fabulous and it was so exciting. And I think we drove most of them crazy, probably.
We've had another question sent in. I must admit to not having read the book. Did your relationship with your father change over time?
Oh, gee, they're good questions this afternoon.
They're excellent questions. Well done,
everyone. That's a very insightful one. Yes and no. He died last year, and was incredibly tough watching him die, this tough man. And he died on the land pretty much with his boots on. He actually only took his boots off 2 days before he died. I mean, he would not take them off beforehand. He remained as tough to the end, and he had the most hideous cancer you could imagine, but he wouldn't give in. And we were terrified of him to the end because he didn't give in, he didn't give an inch. He never ever showed weakness. So from that perspective, we remained in awe and looking up to him and terrified of him. But I do think as I got older and I went and lived my own life and became a lawyer and lived in many different places overseas and in Western Australia for 20 years, a lot of different places and a long way away, that gave me the independence and perhaps a little bit of courage to at least have some more debates with him, because as a child you never answered back. You did as you were told as fast as you could. But as I got older, I was able to have more and more perhaps robust debates also, as we say in the law. And then as he was dying, because he knew I wanted to write this book, we actually had some very special shared moments where we talked about those early days, and he filled in a lot of gaps for me, and he gave me his precious diaries, which was, you know, for Dad an enormous gift, and he entrusted them to me. And so I'm not sure if I could have written the book as frankly as I did if Dad was still here, which also answers the question, but I think by the end, I'd certainly developed a very different relationship with him, albeit still a slightly, you know, a feared one.
Alrighty, I think that's all the questions that we've had sent in. Does anybody have any other questions that they would like to ask Tanya?
Far away if you do.
Give everyone a minute and see if any come through. Oh, here we go. My mother often said that her father was very strict when they lived in England, but relaxed considerably when they arrived in Australia. Oh, I think that's a follow-on from speaking about your own dad.
Yes. Well, I can't say my dad relaxed in any way. In fact, I think had Mum and Dad remained living in country South Australia in the Flinders Ranges, I don't think Dad would have become as tough and as hard as he did, because when he went north in order to survive that harshness of Central Australia, it's unbelievably harsh, this land and this climate. And so in order to survive it, he became harder himself, and I don't think he probably could have survived any other way. So for Dad, it was probably the reverse.
Tanya, when you talk about the diary that your dad left in your book, it's hardly what you'd call a diary, isn't it? Because it's like one-liners, and if you got your name mentioned in the book, you were proud because it was good praise. Is that correct?
That is correct. Back then, it's probably still the case today, Elders GM, which was the stock and station agent that underpinned our station and lots of others, had what they called an annual stock and station diary, and it was a big diary about this big with a page per day. And so Dad had these diaries from 1963, in fact. I think he started them and kept them, but it was not a diary in the sense that you or I perhaps would keep a diary. There was nothing sentimental. There was no hint of emotion. It included things like check the boundary line, have to fix donkey's bore, moved 20 cattle out of the horse paddock, branded 10, have to ring elders to organise trucking, papers in from the bank, need to pump water into house tank. And then every now and then, if we'd done something wrong, like Brett, my brother, who was always in trouble, always, because he was just young and wild, one day he escaped, and the consequences were not good, and he wrote belted Brett in capital letters at the bottom of this very big page. So yes, you could get your name in there for good things and not such good things, but I do recall that he did put in for each of the 4 children the day we were born, and at the same time it was always what the temperature was for the day, the dust conditions, the feed conditions. So our birth was nestled in amongst all these very important, important matters of the land.
We've had another question come through. Is there another book on the horizon?
Well, I do hope so. I said a bit earlier, so forgive me for repeating this if you heard it earlier, that I think there are so many more stories to tell, because this land is so harsh and so isolated, and particularly was back then, that it attracted incredible characters. Incredible characters make for great stories. So I think there are a lot more stories to tell, and I've got some ideas. I can see a book 3 and a book 4. So I'm really hoping that this book goes well and people are interested, and I'll be able to persuade my publisher to support me down that path, because I would really like to tell some more stories because I think there's a lot more to tell.
Fingers crossed. Hopefully they're watching. We've got another one. There are a few snake encounters mentioned in the book. Are you now quite brave around snakes, spiders, all that dangerous anti-wildlife?
Do you know that to this day I'm terrified of snakes? I have never stopped being terrified of snakes. We had so many of them. I remember as a child walking along, and you would often have to jump to avoid a snake. And these just weren't any old snakes. These were king brown mulga snakes, which are as deadly as they get. And I used to have nightmares as a child of snakes and lizards in my bed. And the lizards were the poor old harmless blue tongue. We called them sleepy lizards, you know, the old scaly ones that they look a bit prehistoric. And so I used to have lots of nightmares. Despite never actually having stepped on a snake, and never actually having been attacked by a snake, they still, oh no, just too many close encounters of the slippery kind. And no, I've never grown used to them. Spiders I'm not too keen on either, but I'd prefer a spider than a snake any day, I have to say.
I don't blame you. It looks like that's all the questions that have come through, so I'll hand it back to Angela.
Thank you, Eve. Would you like to do another reading of your book, Tanya?
Well, thank you. That would be a lovely way to finish up. Can I say this has been so much fun? I've absolutely loved this. I hope your viewers at home have been enjoying it as well, learning about life in the bush back in the 60s and 70s. So I'll read a bit from chapter 1, which follows on from the prologue, the cattle duffers, which Angela mentioned. Cattle duffers being cattle thieves. So chapter 1, where it all began. My life as a cattle duffer chaser came about because once upon a time, Enid Blyton, right there at the outset, because once upon a time, a beautiful woman named Janice married a handsome man named Grant. They left the safety and security of South Australia to take up a small cattle lease in remote Central Australia. Mum and Dad were just 26 years old. I was 3, Melissa was 2, and Brett was 1. It was the middle of a 10-year drought that had destroyed the country, and everyone thought they were crazy. But we loved it. As far as our little eyes could see were miles upon miles of emptiness, huge blue skies and bare earth. We heard pink cockatoos squawk in the gum trees and crickets click and clack at night. But it was also a place of silence. There was not a person or town to be heard or seen. We could shout into the hills and hear our voices echo back to us. We could lie on our backs at night and imagine the sky of stars swallowing us whole. We knew we could die out here under the savage summer sun, and our bones would turn white and dissolve in the dry winds, just like the bones of the kangaroos and dingoes. Nobody would ever know we'd been there. We thought that was kind of exciting. Our property was called Bond Spring Station. It was first settled in the 1870s by 2 men who walked all the way from Adelaide to get there. It took them a whole year. I often thought how tired they must have been by the time they arrived, but how happy to discover this beautiful land. Each sunrise and sunset, the high mountains filled with the colours of the day, colours so soft and beautiful after the harshness that it always made my heart sing. Shades of red would turn to apricot, then soft pink, layers of purple, and finally black as the hills dissolved into the night. Every morning the skies and hills would light up again, changing colour in reverse. It was like magic, and I would try to capture it with coloured pencils, but could never capture its true beauty. Nature had its own special paint set. Colour came in other surprising ways too. Even in drought years, mulga trees gave us flowers that shone gold in the sunshine and thick spinifex that looked like straw, making the plains dance with light. It was a land rich with stories of the past. There was the Aboriginal dream time and the sea that had once covered everything here. The powerful forces that had pushed the earth up into the sky, creating huge rocky ranges that ran from west to east, known to the locals as the McDonald Ranges, but to the local Aranda people as Caterpillar Dreaming. It was a small block and I loved it. Thank you.
That's fantastic. We did have another comment from Wendy, and she has written, she was the Undula governess in 73 and 74. And your stories are happy memories as I still keep in touch with everyone. She last visited in February.
Oh, that's wonderful, Wendy. So the Hayes is out on Undula. That's absolutely wonderful. I'm sure they are so happy you keep in touch. Well, I hope my book brings back some great memories for you, especially as life as a governess. They were wild times for young girls on the land.
Excellent. Well, that brings us to the end of our webinar today. I'd really like to thank Tanya, Laura, who is from Allen and Unwin, and Eve for co-hosting this event, and all the viewers that attended today. It's been really fantastic for our first event online. I will be sending out an email link with some feedback form so that we can gather some feedback, so in future we can improve these events and keep on offering them. So if you could fill in your feedback form and get it back to me, that would be fantastic. Thank you very much everyone for joining in.
And Angela, before we go, can I just say thank you again to you and Eve and the Onkaparinga Libraries for this wonderful opportunity. And for all the viewers, I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you grab a copy of the book if you have a chance. And most of all, keep supporting your local libraries.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And don't forget, you can put your copy on hold.
Excellent. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye.